everyone. Welcome to Crime in Court. This is the 1996 Menendez brothers retrial. Erik and Lyle Menendez on trial for the homicides of their parents, Kitty and Jose. We are finally on the defense's case in chief. This is part 5, and we still have their first witness on the stand, which is Dr. Martin Fackler, who is a ballistics wound expert testifying for the defense. We are on cross-examination right now. Let's just dive back into right where we left off, which was they went to lunch on Tuesday, November 21st, 1995. This is the week of Thanksgiving, just to give you some perspective. They're going to talk about that and scheduling and whatnot. So Thursday and Friday, no court. So this is the Tuesday, it's a 3-day week, and they're going to talk a little bit about that. We get started here with the following proceedings were held outside the presence of the jury. The court says, all right, everybody is present. We'll resume now. Ms. Abramson says, Your Honor, before we do that, I just want the court to understand what I've done about scheduling. I have released Dr. Wecht because we knew we could not get him back here Sunday, and therefore we have to keep him, and he didn't, obviously, has objections to that, so I've released him. And I have 2 witnesses for tomorrow, Dwight Van Horn and Ron Linhart from the Sheriff's Department, and I'm going to have Mr. Morton on Monday and Dr. Wecht right behind him, and then we have a nice span of time. The court says, okay. So obviously, Dr. Wecht is in the courthouse, awaiting his turn on the stand, but Dr. Fackler has been going on for longer probably than expected. He has been, some giving long-winded answers as experts sometimes tend to do. So he's been on the stand for a while. And the cross-examination is still ongoing from David Kahn for the state. He is probably in the middle somewhere. He said he still has a lot to go through. So just to give you an idea, he's going to be on the stand the remainder of this Tuesday, and I think most of that Wednesday before they go to Thanksgiving. So FYI, just about that. Ms. Abramson says, now, I can't swear to the court that Linhart and Van Horn will take until 3:15 tomorrow. They may end a little early. The court says, all right, whatever. At least you have 2 more witnesses for tomorrow. Yes, Your Honor. The court says, thank you for letting me know. All right, let's get the jury out, please. The jury enters the courtroom, and the following proceedings were held. Court says the jury's back. We'll resume with the cross-examination. Mr. Kahn says, thank you. Doctor, I think that just before we recessed, you were going to take a look at the wound to the clavicle and mandible of Kitty Menendez to see if you would associate. I'm sorry, I think you were going to take a look at the 2 wounds to the right arm of Kitty Menendez, the forearm and the upper arm, to determine if you would associate those 2 wounds together. Did you have an opportunity to do so? No. I thought when we left you said you were going to provide them for me, and I was waiting for you to do that. Okay, we can do that now. That is what they said. I'll show you the photograph that has been marked 197 for identification and direct your attention to the 2 wounds that appear to the right arm of Kitty Menendez, her lower right arm and her upper right arm. I've reviewed them, yeah. Okay, do you associate those 2 wounds together? They could be associated. They may and they may not. I don't think anybody can tell. Okay, and why is it that no one can tell? Well, you have 2 individual wounds, one on the lower in the forearm and in the upper arm, and the fact that you can bend the arm in such a position that you could probably put a probe through them and appear to be the same wound, that doesn't mean that they are. Maybe they are and maybe they aren't. I can say that's a possibility, and maybe it even might be a likely possibility, but I can't say that happened that way. Is that kind of like the wound to Kitty's left breast and the wound to Kitty's left arm, where yesterday counsel had you count the 16 pellets in the breast and the 4 pellets to the left arm and get a total of 20 pellets? I don't understand the question. Yeah, I didn't either. Do you recall yesterday that counsel was showing you some photographs on the board? Yes. of Kitty's left breast. Yes. Do you recall that she was showing you some photographs of the wound to Kitty's left arm? Yes. And do you recall that you were doing a pellet count? Yeah, I recall now. And do you recall that you came up with 16 pellet defects for the breast? Yes. And you came up with another 4 for the arm. There were 4 in the arm, yes. And do you recall how then counsel asked you how if this makes a total of 20? I'm not sure how she asked the question, but there are clearly 16 holes in the breast and there are clearly the 4 holes in the arm, and I think she was asking me if the arm had been placed in front of the breast and if these were part of the same shot column, if it added up to 20, and I answered yes. I didn't think it had to be that way. I said that was a possibility. Okay. And do you recall how then she asked she asked you if there's another wound that could be associated with the wound to Kitty's left breast? The court says, let's refer them to their full name, because he said Kitty, not Kitty Menendez. Mr. Khan says, yes. Do you recall counsel asked you if there was another wound that could be associated with the left breast of Kitty Menendez and the left forearm of Kitty Menendez? And at that time, you discussed a wound to the dorsal side of Jose Menendez's right arm. Do you recall that? Yes. And do you recall how counsel then used that combination of 3 wounds to get a total of approximately 27 pellets? Objection, Your Honor. That misstates the testimony. No such count was done. Rephrase the question, says the court. Okay, let me ask you this. Were you saying yesterday that you associate the wound to the left breast of Kitty Menendez with the wound to the left forearm of Kitty Menendez? No. What were you saying? I think I was asked if it was possible that a shot column came across the arm and a portion of the shot column was arrested by the arm and certain projectiles remained in the arm and the rest of the shot column went on, and I said that's possible. So to you, that represents nothing more than a possibility, I take it? Yes, that's true. Okay, and the same could be said of the 2 wounds to the right arm of Kitty Menendez. Is that correct? That I just showed you a photograph in 197? Yes, that's also a possibility. Okay, let's talk about these 2 wounds, directing your attention first to the forearm. How far away was that shot fired from? I would estimate the distance to be just a few feet, maybe 3, 4 feet approximately. The upper arm, how far away was that fired from? I'd say approximately the same distance. You indicated that the wound to the right hand of Kitty Menendez could also be associated with the wounds to her clavicle and mandible areas. Is that correct? Yeah, I think that's another possibility. And how far were those shots fired from? They appear to be somewhat further. That's a little more difficult because of the distortion of the tissues. As a very rough estimate, I would say maybe 14 feet or so, but that's a very rough estimate. Could be even further. Directing your attention to the wound that Kitty Menendez received behind her left ear and the wound also caused by birdshot that she received to her left shoulder. Do you associate those 2 wounds together? I think also that's a logical assumption that they probably were the same shot. And how far away were they fired from? I'd like to take a look at the shoulder wound if I might, the photograph. Again, that appears pretty close range shot. I would say maybe 3 to 4 feet. And directing your attention to the shot that appears to her behind her left ear of Kitty Menendez, let me show you another photograph, 195, which you just associated with the left shot. Miss Abramson says you just asked that. The court says no, the previous question related to the shoulder. Miss Abramson said, okay, I'm sorry. Mr. Khan says, would you agree looking at the injury behind the left ear of Kitty Menendez that also appears to be consistent with a shot fired 3 to 4 feet away? Well, in the first place, it's behind and in the forward part of the ear, and it encompasses both the ear behind and forward inferior to it, and it appears to be it could easily be a continuation of the shot column that initially caused the wound to her shoulder. Yes. So that would make it, depending on the position of her head, that would make it somewhat further away and having to have an intermediate target, which was her shoulder. Now, you gave the opinion, I believe, that the wound to the left thigh of Kitty Menendez was inflicted from the back of the thigh to the front of the thigh rather than, as Dr. Golden had suggested, from the front of the thigh to the back of the thigh. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. And how far away was that wound shot from? Well, that's very fairly close range too. I think there's some possibility that may also be a continuation of a shot, and I say this for several reasons. If the volume of the damage in this wound appears a little less than what one would expect, and if we combined it with the large gouge out of her lower leg as we showed the lineup yesterday, then the damage both added together comes up to much more than I would expect would be the volume of damage of this shotgun. And I would think the distance here would be again approximately 4 or 5 feet. Somewhere around there. It's a close range. And you say that you associate those two wounds together, that is, the wound to the thigh and the wound to the calf, because absent the calf wound, you would expect more damage to the thigh? Yes, that's right. I think the association of these two wounds has more evidence for it because of the volume, more than the other wounds that we've just been discussing, because the wound alone I would expect somewhat more damage than what we've seen in this wound, and if we add the damage in the thigh in the lower leg, it makes more sense that they might be add the two damages, and it comes up to more than I would expect from a short range shotgun blast. On what basis do you say that you would expect more damage? What is your point of reference? Well, actually, one point of reference is all the wounds we have in this case and that the volume of wounds. For instance, if you look at the wound on Mr. Menendez's left leg, it appears to me that the damage is significantly more than we're seeing here in this one single wound. But if you add the large gouge of tissue from the lower leg to this, then the volume of the wound appears to balance more likely. Does it appear that her left thigh is also thicker than the area of the left leg of Jose Menendez where he was struck? Well, I don't think it's significantly thicker. He struck well above the knee, and she struck a little bit further on up. If you measured it, it may be an inch thicker. If you measured it, it might be an inch thicker? I would expect so. For Kitty Menendez? Yes. In addition to being an inch thicker, it's also not at a direction or a directly lateral angle as the wound to Jose Menendez, is it? Well, that's true, but in addition, this wound didn't pass through this entire thickness either. So there's pluses and minuses and ways to balance it. And given all those pluses and minuses, how can you say, just looking at this photograph, in light of the three shotgun wounds that you treated in your 31 years, that you would expect more damage unless you round first, unless this wow, blah, blah, blah. Let me start that sentence over. It's a long one, so apologies. And given all the pluses and minuses, how can you say, just looking at this photograph, in light of the three shotgun wounds that you treated in your 31 years, that you expect more damage unless this round first passed through something else? Objection, compound, and argumentative. Sustained. Just looking at that photograph, how can you say that just from that alone you would expect more damage? Well, I think you've been somewhat misled by thinking that my expertise expressed here is based on the small number of shotgun wounds I have treated. Rather, my expertise here is based on my experience with this case and other shotgun cases where I have worked with autopsy photographs as we have in this case. So he's treated a small number of people with his shotgun wounds, but he has analyzed and um, provided consultation on other cases with shotgun wounds for autopsies. So, as he stated before, most people with shotgun wounds end up in the morgue and not in his operating room, basically. Now, I have not worked any other case that approaches this case in the number of shots. Many of the cases I have worked with have just been one shot apiece, but they add up. And that, in combination with my experimental work and recognizing the amount of total momentum that is involved in a shotgun blast and relating that to various rifle blasts, basically, the wound ballistics is quite, the principles of the wound ballistics are the same for a shotgun blast and a rifle blast. It just, so what I'm saying is I'm just giving you this opinion based on my experience in court and my experimental results. And really, it's not really based in any way on my experience in treating shotgun wounds. So once again, he totally puts the prosecutor in his place with that question, I think, because it's like he keeps trying to discredit him, and Dr. Fackler keeps coming back with, well, that's not the role that I'm supposed to be doing, or you're misunderstanding something. So he's very good at taking a question that's trying to attack him or his work and bringing it back to the facts in the case. He says, next question from Mr. Khan says, okay, but the three cases of shotgun wounds that you personally treated in your 31 years, I think I said six. Okay, but can you remember three of them? But you can remember three of them, right? I can remember some detail of about three. Yes, that's correct. Okay, of the three cases that you remember in your 31 years, were any of them in the area of the left thigh, the area of the thigh such as the wound to Kitty Menendez? Objection, irrelevant. Overruled, you can answer the question. The witness says, no, they were not. Mr. Khan says, and were any of them to the area of the left knee, such as in this case of Jose Menendez? No, they were not. So you didn't have an opportunity to. Miss Abramson says, I'm going to object to the last question. Move to strike. It misstates the evidence. There's no wound to the left knee, which I was going to say because he was actually shot in the thigh, not the knee, but they want you to believe that it was the knee because they want you to think that the brothers made it look like they were kneecapped or whatever to make it look like a mafia hit. And the court overrules that because, of course, he does. Whatever. Mr. Khan says, so you didn't have any opportunity on former occasions to compare wounds, shotgun wounds, such as we are now doing for the purpose of determining whether whether the shotgun pellets passed through something prior to hitting the wound area. Did you? Objection, argumentative. Rephrase the question. Mr. Khan says, yes. On any prior occasion, did you have before your involvement in this case, did you ever have any reason to compare shotgun wounds to determine the distances at which the shotgun wounds were fired or whether the shotgun pellets had passed through something before hitting the surface? Oh, certainly. And what reason did you have to do that in the past? Well, there was a case, it was actually Ting versus the FBI, but there was the name of an agent specifically named whose name escapes me, and that was tried in United States court in Los Angeles approximately a year and a half ago. And in the case, a person who was a drug dealer, alleged to be a drug dealer, was being arrested and was being handcuffed, and he broke away and tried to escape, and the FBI agent picked up a shotgun and shot him. The shot column entered his left upper arm, broke the bone, continued on into the chest, and one of the shotgun pellets penetrated his spinal column and made him a quadriplegic. And he lived. And his story was that the FBI agents caught him and held him down on the floor and stood over him with a shotgun and fired at him, causing this wound. And that wound, given the height of the FBI agent and the size of the gun, that we'd be talking of a wound of about a distance of maybe 2 feet. Now, the FBI agent claimed happened. That what happened is he bolted and headed for the door, and the FBI agent fired as he was running, and in this case, the shot column would have hit him at about 7 feet. And so, because this person was alive and not killed, there's a great disadvantage in this type of case because although forensic pathologists are quite good about putting down the size of wounds and things of this sort, my clinical colleagues who treat patients are very remiss in this and rarely do it. So the descriptions and the notes on this case aren't going to be as good as a clinical forensic pathologist, obviously, because that's what they're trained to do. So he had very little information to go on, and it was somewhat difficult because of it. But the critical thing in this case was the distance to differentiate 2 feet from 7 feet. And we won that case. I actually went back to the FBI Academy. We did some test shots into gelatin back there, and of course, we had X-rays of the shot spread, and these were important in this case. And then I had another case 1 year ago in which an officer was alleged to have killed his wife, and in fact, she killed herself with a shotgun, a contact shotgun blast to her mid abdomen. Oh, ooh, that's a way to go. That was with the double aught buckshot in a 12 gauge, and the ting case was also with a 12 gauge. And in this case, in fact, the shot was fired. It was a contact wound, but the officer was being held because the state held that the shot was fired from a 2 feet distance, in which case it would be impossible for her to reach the trigger and commit self deletion. So that was another case that was just a little less than 1 year ago, in which distance was the critical determinant in a shotgun wound case. So those are the two most recent. Pretty good examples there. And neither of those cases involved wounds to the thigh, is that correct? No, one was the abdomen and the other was the upper arm. Mr. Khan says, Your Honor, I have a photograph of a wound to the left thigh of Jose Menendez. I would ask that this be marked as 320. Ms. Abramson says, Your Honor, we already have that in another copy. Court says, All right, has it already been marked? Ms. Abramson says, I think one just like it has already been marked. Mr. Khan says, I think the one we marked is different than this one. It's not a close-up. The court says, why don't you find the one then? You were going to do that yesterday also, Ms. Abramson. She says, I did. I found it. The court says, regarding 318. Ms. Abramson says, yes. Was it the same or a different one? Ms. Abramson says, well, I put them here. The court says, I don't want to get into a discussion. She says, I can show you later. We did find it. Court says, was there another one of that? Of 318, there was. Okay, all right. Again, I don't want to duplicate these. You're certain there's not another one like this? Mr. Khan says, not this one, Your Honor. Court says, all right, it will be 320. Show it to counsel so they can see it. Mr. Khan says, yes. Okay, showing you the photo that is depicted, the wound to the left leg of Jose Menendez. I'll put that on the board after you've had an opportunity to look at it. The witness says yes. In this case, in order for you to determine that the wound to the left thigh of Kitty Menendez should have caused greater damage unless it had passed through something first, is based primarily upon simply looking at the wound to Jose Menendez to the left, to his left knee area. Is that correct? Objection. Argumentative. Overruled. The witness says, no, that's not correct. Mr. Khan says, so what is it based on then? It's based on the totality of all the wounds we're looking at here, plus the other wounds that I have worked with and my experience and with how much potential. Also, some comparison with handguns and rifle wounds because the principles are the same in penetrating projectiles. Now, here you have that the wound to the left calf of Kitty Menendez may be associated with the wound to the left thigh of Kitty Menendez. Is that correct? I think it's a possibility. Okay, and is this something that you think is just a mere possibility or it's logical that they were connected? I think it's more logical that they were connected because, as I mentioned, if you add the two damages together, I know it's a rough estimate, but you asked me for an opinion, and my best opinion is that if you add, because of the fact that this lacks a little bit of the damage potential I would expect, and that would be added by the other one, to me, it makes more sense that they would be connected than some of the other ones, like her right arm would be. And the wound that we're talking about now is depicted in photograph 198. Is that correct? That's correct. Now, is that the type of wound that is sometimes called a graze wound? I guess it could be called a graze wound. I tend to think of a graze wound as a wound that just tends to graze the skin and maybe penetrates through the skin, but not much further through the skin. I think some people would call this a graze wound. Some people will call a graze wound any wound that there is no distance, entrance, and exit, and in other words, a wound where you don't have a skin ridge in the middle. Some people will call, I think, if you look at the dictionary definition of graze, the dictionary definition of graze implies a much more superficial wound. I would call this a gutter wound or a gouged out wound. And would it be your testimony that all of the shot fired in the shot column struck that left calf? Probably not. Well, it's difficult to say. Most of the shot column would, but I would expect that the ones on the very top of if you will, if you cut a cross section through the top column on the shot column, certainly the ones on the lower half of the shot column would have, and maybe some above that half. But I think the few on top would not have. And how far would you say was the distance from that was fired? I think about 4 or 5 feet approximately. And then directing your attention to the wound to Kitty Menendez, for which there was testimony that the shot entered the bottom portion of her left leg and passed through and exited the upper part of her leg. Do you agree with the way that those two wounds were associated together? You're speaking of the one that went across the popliteal fossa, came out and re-entered. Is that the one? Yes. Yes. Are you asking I agree with that now? Yes. Showing you photograph 189, which depicts what I believe has been referred to as the entry and exit wound for that particular shot. What was the question? My question was, do you agree that you would associate those wounds together as being part of a single shot? Yes, I would not disagree with that. I think that was a revision of Dr. Golden's, and I think it makes sense. Yes. Okay, I'll put that on the board. When you say it makes sense, are you saying that you can say to reasonable medical certainty that that was all part of one wound, or are you saying that that was just one possibility among many? He's not a oh no, he is a medical expert. Um, yes, so he can say medical certainty. Sorry, I was confused there for a second. Well, because he's a wound ballistics expert, so he knows so much about ballistics that I forgot that he's actually a surgeon for a second. Well, I think it's likely. I don't know. Dr. Golden thought it was, and it appears, I've seen the x rays also, and combining them with this, it appears likely that this is the same wound. And how far away was that shot fired from? Somewhere about 5 or 6 feet. Now, in your testimony, you discussed something called yaw. Could you tell us what yaw is? Yes, yaw is the angle. The yaw angle is the angle between the long axis of a projectile and its line of flight. So if an elongated projectile, say the point of a bullet, is going with 0 degrees of yaw, that means it's traveling straight ahead. If it's going with 90 degrees of yaw, that means it's traveling sideways. Now, you don't have that same problem when you're dealing with shotgun pellets, do you? No. Circular projectile doesn't have a yaw because it's the same. It has the same axis. No matter how it turns, because it's a circle, it doesn't change. Did you say, however, that the concept of cavitation also applies to shotgun pellets? Yes. And why does that apply to shotgun pellets? Well, the cavitation is a phenomenon that's, if we could go back to my analogy of it being a splash, it's associated with the aerodynamic shape of the projectile. And a pointed projectile, for instance, is very aerodynamic and flies through the air with little disturbance on the air and doesn't lose it as much velocity. The same projectile, yawed, going sideways, of course, is not aerodynamic and causes a bigger split if it hits something. Now, a round ball is inherently what we call a blunt projectile. Inherently, it has a poor aerodynamic shape, and its very nature, it would cause a larger splash. I think the analogy of a diver going into the water straight, making a perfect dive, causing a little splash, and then going in sideways, making a large splash. If you want to extend that analogy to the round ball, you could say if this person does what's called in some circles a cannonball dive, there's where a person would go off the diving board and clasp his arms around his knees and form his body as close to the ball shape as you could. He makes a big slash. That's a great analogy and a good way to kind of explain how a projectile would hit. So, the cavitation for shotgun pellets is simply that space between the body that will be included within the outer range of the pellets. No, the cavitation of shotgun pellets varies greatly depending on the distance of fire. When the shotgun pellets strike as a single pellet, I mean as a single projectile, in other words, they're in one mass. They will cause cavitation very similar to a solid mass of that size. And you can equate this, I think, under direct, I equated it to something, a rifle or something under the nature of a 45-70 that has a 300 to 500 grain bullet at the velocity of 1300 feet per second, which gives you a cavity, a large temporary cavity of, when it mushrooms, it would very similarly give you a cavity of what you'd likely expect from a shotgun column acting as a single projectile, and which would be a cavity, or certainly larger than a cantaloupe, but smaller than a cantaloupe, or smaller than a watermelon, somewhere in between that size. Now, if this is when they're going together. Now, to extend that as they go together, or as they go further out, say shotgun pellets hitting at a distance of 20 or 30 feet, where each individual pellet will have a small cavity of its own. And this small cavity may be the diameter of the pellet, in this case, 0.24 hundredths of an inch, and each cavity may be only an inch in diameter, but then if they're closer together, then you'd have one or two, or all these would tend to be added. But it gets very complex as you between the two extremities of one cavity, because they're all together and entirely individual cavities if they're all separate. That was a long explanation. Let me show you what's been marked as 272 for identification in this case. This is the illustration that depicts what Dr. McCarthy described as shot 12. This reconstruction depicts a shot to the left cheek area of Kitty Menendez. Having viewed that wound in the photograph, do you not quarrel with the conclusion that that was a contact wound? Is that correct? That's correct. That's correct. Yes. Is there anything about the trajectory that is depicted in this photograph that you would quarrel with? No, it's a little bit difficult to ascertain the trajectory until you get right up there and look at the size of the circle on the end of the bar. It's tilting somewhat towards us, but basically, no, I don't have anything to quarrel with that trajectory. As far as the position of the relative positions, you can view the photograph, by the way, 196. Does that show does that show the wound that we're talking about? Yes, it does. As far as the relative positions of the victim and the shooter in this illustration, do you have any quarrel with the way that the victim is represented as lying on her right side, as she receives the wound to her left cheek? Well, I'm not sure. If you could restate the question, I'm not sure I'm getting everything you're saying. The The question is, as far as the way in which the illustration depicts the victim lying on her right side as she received that wound to her left cheek, do you have any medical basis upon which you would quarrel with the conclusion that is depicted here, that she is lying on her right side at the time that that shot was fired? Well, I don't think you can make the conclusion. You asked me if I had any quarrel with the angle relative to her head, and I said I don't, but I certainly have a quarrel saying that because of the angle she was in that position. That angle could be duplicated by thousands of different positions. All right. But I'm not asking you if. I'm not asking you if you have a medical basis upon which you can conclude that that was the only angle at which it was fired. My question to you is, do you have any medical basis upon which you can conclude that the victim was not in that position at the time that the shot was fired? Oh, no, I can't rule it out. I can't rule it in. Of course not. And as far as the relative position of the shooter at the time that that shot was fired, do you have any quarrel with the shooter's relative position as represented in this illustration? Ms. Abramson says, Your Honor, I'm going to object to the question. It assumes facts, not in evidence. Court says, well, there's no shooter depicted in this drawing, number one, and number two, it's not clear what you mean by a quarrel. Mr. Khan says, do you have any medical basis upon which you can conclude that at the time that that shot was fired, the shotgun was not positioned in the manner that is depicted in this illustration? The same objection, Your Honor, assumes facts, not in evidence. Court says, are you able to answer that question? The witness says, well, I think I'll try. Court says, okay. The witness says, in the first place, there's no shotgun depicted here. Are you asking me to assume the rod there is the shotgun? Yes. Let me ask you this first. You previously said that that's a contact wound. Is that correct? Yes. Okay, now this illustration, how the shotgun would have been placed to the victim to obtain that shot. Is that correct? Ms. Abramson says, objection, Your Honor, calls for speculation. The court says, well, why don't you ask him to assume that? Mr. Khan says, assuming that this illustration depicts how the shotgun was placed at the time of the final shot to Kitty Menendez, do you have any medical basis upon which you can say that the shotgun was not so positioned? No, I don't. There's nothing that you've seen in any of the autopsy reports of Dr. Golden which would cause you to say that this illustration is wrong in the manner in which it depicts that shotgun wound to Kitty Menendez. No, that's true. Sure. If the shotgun was there and she was in that position, which is not established by any medical evidence that I know of, but if I'm asked to assume that, and then the shot and that rod I'm asked to assume is a shotgun, sure, that's a possibility. And you understand that at the time that the body of Kitty Menendez was found, she was in that position. Is that correct? Objection, Your Honor, no foundation. Rephrase the question and assumes facts not in evidence. Mr. Khan says, have you looked at the crime scene photographers of the bodies of Kitty and I think he means the crime scene photographs of the bodies of Kitty and Jose Menendez? Yes. Have you seen the ones that depict the position of their bodies at the time that they were found at the crime scene? Yes. And does that illustration appear to represent the position of Kitty Menendez at the time that the body was found? Well, from what I can see of the body, yes, but you only see about less than half the body. But from what I can see of the body, it's consistent with it. Have you seen another illustration which depicts the remainder of the body behind the coffee table at the time of shot 12? You mean the illustration of the same format as these? Yes. I'm not sure if I have. I think I have, but if you... All right, let me show you what has been marked as 273 for identification. Do you recognize 273 as an illustration that you've previously seen? Yes. And does that appear to be consistent with the position of the body of Kitty Menendez at the time that her body was discovered by the police? Yes. Now, having seen the entire depiction of the body of Kitty Menendez at the time that she was found, do you have any medical basis upon which you can say that the illustration does not accurately depict the position of the shotgun at the time that the wound was inflicted to her left cheek. The witness says, may I manipulate these two and look at the last two separately? The court says yes. Mr. Khan says certainly. The court says perhaps you can secure that in some way, Mr. Khan, so it doesn't fall. The witness says, the reason I wish to see them separately is because when I looked at the second one down here, it appeared that it was not the same angle as appeared in the other one. And now, in looking at the dimensional change, I recognize that it is. And yes, I agree. Okay. Showing you the exhibit that has been marked as 270 for identification, this is an exhibit that has been described as representing the shot to Kitty Menendez, which struck both the left shoulder area and the area behind the left ear, which you indicated was consistent with a single shot. Assuming that the green bar in that diagram represents the trajectory at which the shot was fired, is there any medical basis upon which you can say that this particular shot was not inflicted upon Kitty Menendez as illustrated in this diagram? No. And you have placed this shot at approximately fired 3 to 4 feet away from the left shoulder of Kitty Menendez. If this diagram is correct, then if this diagram is correct, then would that place the shooter somewhere approximately right here? Mr. Khan points to the exhibit. That is, standing between the coffee table and the sofa at the time he is firing that shot into the left shoulder and left ear of Kitty Menendez. Actually, it appears to me more likely that in order for that one to line up, he'd have to be standing on the coffee table to do that to get that far away. I'm sorry, that he would have to be where? I think in order to, if I could illustrate on it, seems to me that in order to get the end of the shotgun barrel here at that downward angle, I don't think that the defendants, whom looked to be normal sized people, could be that high. I think one of them would have to be standing on the table to get high enough to line it up in that distance. Okay. And is that because you are saying that you can determine from looking at the wounds that the shot was fired at that particular angle? Or are you saying that if this angle was depicted in this illustration is correct, they would have to be at that height? Yes, that's what I thought the question was. I was asked to assume this angle is correct. Is that not the format of your question? Yes, that was my question. Yes, and then my answer is if you assume that to be right, then in my opinion, someone would have to be standing. I don't think standing on the floor they would get high enough. Okay, now, did you read the testimony of Dr. McCarthy when I asked Dr. McCarthy what was the essential information that he was seeking to communicate through the illustration? I don't recall that, no. Do you recall Dr. McCarthy saying that all he was really, Ms. Amerson says, I'm going to object to this, Your Honor, as hearsay. What Dr. McCarthy said, the witness didn't read it. The court says, we don't know. He said he read most of McCarthy's testimony. Ms. Abramson says, I would still object to reciting McCarthy's testimony without a foundation. The court says, I assume it's a premise to a question. At this point, it's overruled, subject to a motion to strike. Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Khan says, do you recall Dr. McCarthy testifying that the essential information that he was seeking to communicate through the illustration was simply that the shot to the left elbow or to the left shoulder and the left ear was part of a single shot fired upon the victim at the time that she was lying on her right side on the floor? No, I don't recall that testimony. Okay. Did you feel, by virtue of this illustration, that Dr. McCarthy was suggesting this particular angle, which is depicted in this illustration, is the only correct angle rather than an angle slightly lower? I didn't assume anything. You asked me to assume this is the correct angle, and I've answered the question based on that. I mean, he did. All right. You told us earlier that you quarreled or had some disagreement with various aspects of Dr. McCarthy's reconstruction in this case. Is that correct? Yes. Now, I'm no longer asking you about the question I asked you. I'm asking you another question. Okay. My question is, as you reviewed these illustrations, and in particular this illustration here for shot 11A, did you assume that what Dr. McCarthy was seeking to communicate in this illustration was that the angle had to be in the same precise manner in which it is depicted here, rather than in a slightly different angle such as this? Well, I guess my natural assumption, seeing an illustration like this, is that the person who depicted it was establishing the angle that he felt most accurately represented the real angle. So I assume he was trying to represent it as it was. Okay. Now, assuming the author of that angle were to say that what he was seeking to communicate in this illustration was not so much the precise angle, but simply that the shoulder injury and the ear injury could be connected together and was inflicted while the victim was on the right side. Would you then be able to consider the possibility, for purposes of discussion, that this angle was slightly different than depicted in this illustration? Objection, Your Honor. There's about six choices. Compound calls for speculation, ultimately irrelevant. The court says it is argumentative as praised. Assuming hypothetically that this angle, which depicts the trajectory, were lowered so that it is coming more at this angle as I am now depicting, then is the manner in which then in the manner in which it is depicted in this illustration, Miss Abramson says, well, Your Honor, I'm going to object to assuming that as a hypothetical unless there's an offer made that someone's going to testify to that. Overruled. The witness says, actually, I think the line you drew would you appear to draw about a 15-degree variation from that. I think you'd have to come down about 10 more degrees for it to line up. Okay, 25 degrees? I think if you take 25 degrees off that angle, it's possible, yes. Do you think that it is medically possible that Kitty Menendez was shot in both her left elbow and in the area of her left ear? The court says, you keep pointing to your shoulder and talking about the elbow. Mr. Khan says, I'm sorry, the left shoulder. Do you think it is medically possible that Kitty Menendez was struck in her left shoulder and her left ear as part of the same single shot while she was lying on her right side on the floor, as that much is depicted in this illustration? Was that a question? As that is depicted in the illustration, that is, this depicts the body of Kitty Menendez being struck in the left shoulder and left ear area while she's lying on her right side. Is that correct? That it depicts? Yes. Do you feel that that is medically possible? It's medically possible, sure. Okay, and assuming that that shot was fired about 25 degrees lower than the angle that is depicted in that illustration, do you feel that such an angle, imaginary angle now, could represent the trajectory in this case, that is, the trajectory at which the shot was fired to the body of Kitty Menendez? No, it could not? No. Why is that? Well, if you make the angle 25 degrees lower, you can't hit the shoulder with the and hit the head. I mean, it would miss the head. So what you're saying then is that it is not possible for someone to stand above Kitty Menendez and to fire a shot into her shoulder and into her head as she is lying on her right side. Well, if she's lying in that position, no, it's not. If you ask in the hypothetical, you asked if we would lower this line if I could demonstrate what I'm talking about. You suggested that given the shoulder wound, and it's pretty accurately, if we take this and lower this 25 degrees, it misses her head by several inches. That's the point I'm making. So what you're saying is you're telling us now that the wound to Kitty's left shoulder and the wound to Kitty's Menendez's left ear could not have possibly been inflicted by a single shot while she was lying on her right side on the floor. Objection, argumentative, misstates the testimony. Overruled. Has this judge sustained anything in this portion that we've been reading? I don't think so. Mr. Khan says, "Is what you're saying, sa- sorry, is that what you're saying, doctor?" "No, I'm saying in that position. You asked me. All these questions have been based on the premise that she's lying on the position that she is depicted here, which is the position that we've established was the position she was found in. You're asking me about this position. And then the next question you asked me was on her right side. That's not the only position Kitty Menendez could assume on her right side." "Okay. How would she be different? In order for a single shot to be fired that would strike her in both her left shoulder and her left ear while she was lying on her right side, how would she have to be depicted differently?" "Well, there's several ways it's possible, if I may illustrate." "Sure. If you want to keep her body in the same position, if you put her head straight up, that would do it. See, her head is dropped down to the side. If she put her head straight up, then that would line up. That would be the way of doing it. So if somehow she drooped her shoulder down out of the way or some other, I guess there's lots of ways of doing it, but you can't do it this way without changing the angle. And if you change the angle, you miss the head." My question is, are you quarreling with the concept that Kitty Menendez could have been shot both in the left shoulder and the left ear, or are you while she was lying on her right side on the floor? Or are you quarreling with the artist's depiction of her in this illustration? I'm not quarreling with anyone. I'm just trying to point out to you and trying to answer your questions, your hypothetical, as best I can, showing you why it doesn't work in this position. I think it is very likely that the same shot that hit Kitty Menendez's shoulder also hit her ear. And this depiction, it makes it very difficult. But there are various other positions she could have been in, standing and sitting and doing various things where it would be possible, certainly. It can't happen there in this position, which is the position she was found in. Okay, what your. It could have been. It could not have happened in the position she was found in. Is that what you're saying? Not according to the diagram you've shown me here and asked me to assume it's correct. He's answered that like 1,000 times. Are you talking now about the diagram or are you talking about the manner in which she was found? Well, we just established that they're the same, didn't we? Is that in fact correct? Are you saying that at the time she was found, her body was precisely as depicted in that illustration? Well, I thought we agreed that it was. I can't say precisely, but very close to the position that I saw on the crime scene photographs. Do you feel that that illustration accurately represents the manner in which her body appeared at the time she was found at the crime scene? I feel it does, yes. And so you feel, based upon your review of the photographs in this case, that the last shot could not have been inflicted to her while she was in that precise position. Objection, Your Honor. That misstates the testimony. Sustained. Oh, finally we get a sustained. Mr. Khan says, I'm asking you, do you feel that the last shot to her left shoulder, I'm sorry, do you feel that the shot to her left shoulder and to the area of her left ear could have been inflicted while she was in the same position in which she was found at the time of the police arrival? Well, it seems from this depiction here basically proves that it couldn't. Again, sir, I got away from that picture there in my last question. What I'm asking you about, let me show you what has been marked as 7 for identification. Do you recognize that to be a photograph of the crime scene? Yes, I do. Okay, now I'm not asking you about the illustration. I'm asking you about the body of Kitty Menendez at the crime scene, okay? Yes. Now, do you feel that a shot could have been inflicted to the body of Kitty Menendez, striking both her left shoulder and her left ear while she was lying on her right side, as depicted in the photograph of her in the crime scene? If I may. Actually, the angle lines up quite well with the one that's predicted here, which we've established can't happen. So the answer to the question, I don't think she could have been shot unless the shooter stood on the couch or the table. Okay, now putting aside the precise manner in which she is depicted here at the crime scene. Thank you. You may return to your seat. Putting aside the precise manner in which she is depicted in the photograph, do you think it is medically possible that she could have been shot in her left shoulder and in the area of her left ear while lying on her right side? In any position on her right side? Any position. Or in the position you see here? Any position on her right side. Well, as I've testified earlier, if she were conscious and rather than having her head drooped, if she had her head erect, it would be possible. But it's not possible with her unconscious or anyhow in having her head draped like she does here. It's not possible. Or another possibility is that aside from her head being more erect, her shoulder might have been in a slightly different position. Is that true? I was thinking of that, and that's a little bit more difficult to do. I guess it's possible, but I think it would be very difficult to be having you have to, you have a certain minimum width of the chest, and in order to get that shoulder down, and you'd have to either put her more sideways or something. I don't think you can do it with the shoulders relatively perpendicular to the ground. I'm not asking you to assume that her shoulder I'm not asking you to assume her shoulder as relatively perpendicular to the ground because I'm not asking you about a photograph right now. I'm asking you about whether it would be possible if her shoulder were in a different position than that which is depicted in the photograph, whether a single shot, could have caused the injury to both her left shoulder and to the area near her left ear. Was an assumption in this question that she is lying on the ground resting on her right side? Somehow on her right side, that's correct. Somehow on her right side, that's very difficult to imagine that as a possibility. So her head would have to be up somewhat, head would have to be erect. Okay, and in that scenario, she would have to be alive for her head to be erect somewhat. That would be the best way to have it there. I guess if there were something else found that her head was resting on, if she's not alive, she can't hold her head up voluntarily. So unless there's something under her head to hold it, yes. Okay, then assuming that this was the next to the last shot fired, I understand you disagree with that. Just as a matter. Disagree with what? The sequence of the wounds in this case. The sequence of the wounds in this case, yeah, I can't establish. I can't agree or disagree because I think they cannot be established. Okay, I understand that, but just assuming that this is the next to the last shot that was fired, would it be your opinion then that at the time that the shot was fired, striking Kitty Menendez in her left shoulder and her left ear, Kitty Menendez was necessarily alive during this shot because her head had to be in an erect position in order for that shot to take place? If I assume that I'm to assume this is the next to the last shot, and then you're also in the assumption is the contact wound is the last shot. Is that it? I don't think that's necessary for the assumption. Okay. Assuming that this is the exit to the last shot, or is the next, how did I see exit? Is the next to the last shot in the sequence of shots that were fired for purposes of that assumption, for purposes of that hypothetical, it would be your opinion that Kitty Menendez was alive at the time that the shot was fired because her head had to be lifted in order for that shot to take place. Is that correct? Well, no, because if you make the assumption that this is the next to the last shot fired, that means that the other shots that hit her front on, you had two shots of number two or number four buckshot that hit her straight on, and I think the chances of her remaining conscious after those two are remote. And therefore, because of that, I don't think If this is the next to the last shot, she would have been conscious. So therefore, no. The hypothetical can't hold up because of that. You're saying Kitty Menendez would no longer be conscious after she was shot in the face? Those 2 shots in the face. Yeah. This is very uncertain because of the number of shots in the skull film, even with 2 views, the front and the side view, because of the tremendous number of shots in that from the birdshot added the 2 buckshot. It's extremely difficult to establish where those shots went. Birdshot, remember, is a lot more smaller pellets, so they spread out and strike many more areas. But if you know, given 2 buckshot shots to the face, and there's certainly indication on those x-rays that several of those buckshot appear to be back very likely embedded in brain tissue in a very critical area of the brain, which is near the base of, the cerebellum and the brainstem, and the very critical portions of the brain. Certainly highly unlikely that she would remain conscious after that. I mean, he backs up his answers. He's a good witness. So, what 2 buckshot wounds are you referring to? What 2 buck? Excuse me, I need a sip of water. 1 second. Sorry. Mr. Khan says, so what 2 buckshot wounds are you referring to as being the 2 buckshot wounds that would have caused unconsciousness? Well, we had 2. I'll look at the numbers up just in a second here. Number 2 is one of them, and number 3 is another. The court says, once again, those were Dr. Golden's designations. The witness says, yes, Your Honor. Mr. Khan says, so number 2 then is that would be the one that went into the area of her her right eye, this shot here. Is that correct? And the one in the forehead would be included in that, yes. Okay, all right. And number 3 is what Dr. Golden described as the wound to the mandible and the clavicle area. Is that correct? Yes, that's right. And, excuse me, and is it your understanding that the shot to the mandible and clavicle area, which is the jaw and the collarbone, sent buckshot up into her brain? Oh, it's very possible because of the trajectory along the mandible is front to back, and certainly some of the projectiles broke the mandible. And one, a little medial to that, would actually come, right into the brain. Okay, so we're talking then, getting back to the photograph I just showed you, 194. You're referring to these wounds here, which are to the right jaw? Yes, that's right. As being wounds that may have caused buckshot to go up into her brain. Oh, certainly, certainly. Possibly you don't recognize that the brain comes down below the ear as you get back to the back part of it. It's not all up in the front. Now, do you know which specific, perhaps if you can go to the photograph and show us which specific areas of the mandible area appear to show pellet defects that could account for pellets going up into her brain? Right here right here is a hole that might be a double with 2 buckshot. Here's another one. Here's a graze wound right in this dark area here. I can't tell how many wounds there are. And right here, there appears to be one on the edge of her mouth and maybe one here. It's very difficult to say, but there are sufficient areas there where that could enter. All right, thank you. And as I say, if you go from that area, if you go from the mouth back, you get near the base of the brain area. The brain droops down back there. Based upon Dr. Golden's report from 1989, did you see any indication in this report that he was able to trace the path of pellet defects extending from the mandible to the area of the brain? Actually, I think he says that it's very difficult to separate the trajectory of the two because they're so close together, but he does say here a couple things that are interesting. Let me see. I notice here on page 3 where he says, quote, should be noted that shotgun wound number 1 is close and contiguous to shotgun wound number 2, likewise involving the head, and shotgun wound number 2 involving the right mandibular. And I can quote, hence, all the three can't be exactly distinguished. All have produced multiple comminuted fractures of the calvarium and base of the skull. Excuse me, I am not a medical expert. I don't know these words. So, any fracture that, anything that produces a fracture of the base of the skull is likely to cause unconsciousness. So, it fractured the skull in the back, the base of the skull. So, again, this guy comes with receipts. He knows what he's talking about. He went straight to the report, right where it was. Like, this guy is a really good witness. He's like, yeah, you asked me a question that you're trying to trip me up on. Yeah, it's right here. Let me show you exactly where it is in his report. Excuse me. Also, his opinion on shot number 2, his opinion, this is considered a fatal wound to the head. But there, he was talking about how shotgun wound number 1 and shotgun wound number 2 were contiguous, and those two wounds are the wounds to the left side of the head. That is the bird shot to the left ear area and the wound to the right eye area. Is that correct? Okay, 1 and 2, but then he continues on to 3 here also when he was talking. Quote, as described above, there are individual pellet wound defects of the tongue, most likely related to number 3, but cannot be excluded that they were spread from number 2. So he mixes 2 and 3. This is on page 5, bottom of the second paragraph, starting with as described above. Okay, but here in the photograph that you're referring to, he is describing shotgun wound number 3. That is the wound to the mandible and the clavicle area. Is that correct? Yes, I'm trying to show you that these three, because these three wounds are so close together and the paths, one gets the impression that it's very difficult for him to dissect out separately. And since there's so many fractures, it would be almost impossible to follow one through without knowing you may be going over into another one. It's an extremely difficult thing. Yes, yes. But earlier, when he speaks about how shotgun wound number 1 and number 2 may be interrelated, he is making reference to areas inside the brain. Whereas in the photograph that you are currently referring to, that is in a discussion of the wound to the right mandible, he is simply speaking about pellet wound defects in the area of the tongue. Is that correct? Objection argumentative and compound. Overruled. The witness says, no, the tongue is where he's picking it up, but it's a track that goes through the tongue and is continuing backward, and in back of the tongue is the brain. Mr. Khan says, I understand that, but where is the discussion of this particular wound? Does Dr. Golden give the opinion that some of the pellets did in fact go as far as to enter up into the brain? Well, let me point out to you on shot number 2, this is on page 4, the opinion. This is considered a fatal wound to the head. And then again on page 5, which that was number 2 he was talking about. He's talking about number 3, and he says on page 5, again, under the last paragraph opinion, this is considered a fatal gunshot wound. So both of these he considers fatal gunshot wounds. And you're asking me to assume that neither of these wounds would have caused unconsciousness and Kitty would have been conscious after they were inflicted, and this is why I think your hypothetical is unlikely. Whoa, that's a great answer. This guy just keeps knocking them down every time the prosecutor is trying to like catch him in something, like trying to catch him or, discredit him. He's like, no, no, let me prove to you why I'm right and you're wrong. And he does. Like, he comes with receipts, and it's great. So you're saying that because this wound to the right mandible was, in the opinion of Dr. Golden, a fatal wound, that in and out of itself necessarily means that Dr. Golden was of the opinion that some of the pellets went up into the brain? He was of the, well, I would think they would either go up to the brain or they would have caused each of these wounds, both of the wounds, he says, these are fatal wounds. Right. What does fatal mean? That it would cause death. Yes. Now, where does Dr. Golden say that this particular wound resulted in some pellets going up into the brain? Oh my God. It's a very logical conclusion that that's what it did in order for it to be fatal. Well, the reason I pointed this out is to indicate that that is probably what he was assuming, because there's only two ways of when you say a fatal wound, there's two things that you would think. Either you have injured the brain directly, or you have caused enough contusion around the base of the brain, so you've contused the spinal cord, or you have put holes in very large blood vessels like the carotid blood vessels. Those are the only reasons that one could say that an individual shot in this area would be fatal. Let me show you the photograph that has been marked as 190. Do you recognize that one? Yes, I do. Okay, and the one that you're talking about here, we've been referring to it as the wound to the mandible area. Although, in fact, to be more precise, this wound is described by Dr. Golden as the wound which goes into her right clavicle area and also is part of this wound into her right mandible area. Is that correct? That's the way he describes it, yes. And it would be based upon what he discussed in his report that some of the pellets also went into the area of the tongue and the mouth. Is that correct? Yes. All right. Are you telling us that unless some of those pellets went into the brain, that we are now looking at is not a fatal wound? Which wound? The wound that we've been describing. The one to the clavicle? As consisting of the wound that extends or includes not only the clavicle but all these large pellet defects, but also the wound up here into her jaw, into the right side of her jaw. You're saying unless these pellets go up into the brain that it's not a fatal wound. Surely that's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah. Is this guy, yeah, this guy's a doctor. Dr. Fackler is a doctor. Dr. Khan is like shooting someone in the tongue or the jaw is going to kill them instantly? No, it's not that doesn't cause a fatality. The reason they no longer are living is because there's injury to the brain, obviously. Okay, but this prosecutor is trying to insinuate that no, you could just die from a shotgun wound to the jaw, which he already told you that that happens all the time in self-deletions where people miss their brains because the angle of the gun makes it go up and then they, not to be crude, but they literally blow off their face, but their brain remains intact and they live. And he's had to operate on people like this. So he just told them this in yesterday's episode. Ms. Abramson says, objection, argumentative. The witness answered to the contrary. The court says, did I finish the answer? Oh, wait, sorry. The next question was, it's not necessary for the pellets to go up into the brain to be a fatal wound, is it? Objection, argumentative. Witness already answered to the contrary. The court says, the way he answered it is a little ambiguous. Why don't you explain your answer? Yes, I'd like to explain the answer, he says. The area in the clavicle, if one of these divided the subclavian artery, which is not in evidence, then that could make it a fatal wound because it's a very large artery. Now, if one of the ones in the mandible happened to hit the internal carotid artery, which again is not in evidence, that would make it a fatal wound. Failing that, the other way a fatal wound is caused is wounds penetrating the brain or actually coming close enough to the brain or hitting the outside of the brain where the fractures of the base of the brain could contuse the brain so that it wouldn't work long enough so the person would die of asphyxia. Those are the only ways to cause death. This wound to the mandible, people can live with their mandible entirely shot away. I mean, as I described earlier on cross-examination, people that try to commit self-deletion blow the middle part of their face away, and much of the mandible will be blown away, and that's not a fatal wound. So, you gave us oh, sorry. I was continuing on like it was him. Let me take a break and a pause. So, yeah, I mean, that's what I just said, pointing out to his cross-examination from yesterday's episode that people do survive without a jaw. And he's trying to make it like this doctor doesn't know what he's talking about. So you gave us three possibilities for how this wound could be fatal. Is that correct? One is that it could sever the subclavian artery. The second is that it could sever the carotid artery. And the third is that it could penetrate the brain. Is that correct? Penetrate the brain or hit the skull and cause fracture of the skull, which would cause sufficient sudden movement of the brain, called a severe concussion, to cause death. When Dr. Golden indicated in his report that this was a fatal wound, you don't know which possibility he was relying upon because none of those possibilities were mentioned in his report. Is that correct? That is correct. But he already said that neither of the arteries were severed. So it has to be damage to the brain somehow. Okay, so you don't have any evidence from Dr. Golden's report of 1989 that any of the pellets from the shot went into the brain. Is that correct? That's right, I don't. I did, however, go over the x-rays. Okay, and in this instance, we have x-rays of both views, the front and the side. And in looking at the x-rays, you saw pellets? Well, I think there's a good possibility that there's a buckshot in the brain. The back of the brain, the serious part, the most important part is the back of the brain stem area. So you can't say from looking at the x-rays which shot put that pellet in the back of the brain, can you? No, I can't. But it is a buckshot rather than a birdshot, so therefore it destroys your hypothetical because you asked me to assume the birdshot was next to the last shot and the last shot was the other birdshot. So if it's a buckshot, it's got to be one previous to your hypothetical, which would have very likely rendered Mrs. Menendez unconscious at least, and therefore she would not have been able to hold up her head, which has been what I have said, that I don't think she was conscious after the first round of shots, and that Lyle probably didn't even need to come back in and, finish it. Um, to, you know, he probably, maybe she was unconscious and in the process of dying and making noises. I don't know, but they were afraid that she was still alive, so that I believe that's why they went and reloaded. However, I don't even think it was a necessary thing. I don't think that she would have made it, honestly. And this doctor doesn't think so either. Even if she had been, they stopped and got her medical attention, I don't think that she would have lived. All right, the next question is, okay, now we're talking about, before you said that there were two wounds, before you said that there were two wounds which would have caused unconsciousness. Now we're down to one wound. Is that correct? Because we can only say for sure that one wound put a buckshot to the back of the brain and Kitty Menendez, and that might have been the wound to the area of the right eye. Is that correct? No. Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative and compound. Sustained. The answer stricken. Is it possible that the wound that put the buckshot to the back of the brain to Kitty Menendez was the wound to the area of the right eye? I think that's most unlikely. Why is that unlikely? Because the penetration depth of the wounds, as you recall, I explained earlier, one of the buckshot is flattened out without even penetrating the outer wall of the frontal sinus, which is not very thick. And the others tend to have penetrated some facial bones and broken some facial bones, but not gone much deeper. I feel that these most certainly had to be secondary, had to have gone through something first. And so therefore, I don't think one of these could have gotten around to the back of the brain. Could it have gone to the near, could it have gone in near the area, the orbit of the right eye? Directing your attention now to 194, which shows two large defects above the orbit of the right eye. Could one of those defects have caused the pellet to go through into the back of her brain? Well, as I just said because of the penetration depth, I think that's highly unlikely, because the other pellets in that same group did not penetrate nearly deep enough to get the whole way back to the back of the brain. So, because none of the pellets did it, you concluded that because none of the pellets didn't, or because most of the pellets didn't, you concluded that none of the pellets could have done that. Well, yeah, I think it's when you're dealing with a group of pellets that hits a substance and they've come from that same shotgun and have hit the same distance and shooting into gelatin or anything else, they'll have a given velocity. They'll have close to the same penetration depth. It would be highly unlikely for all of them, but one to stop in the penetration depth of 1.5 inches or so, and one to go 8 inches. Like yeah, that's a huge difference. Okay, so you concluded then that the shot to the right eye of Kitty Menendez definitely made her unconscious and there was no further movement on her part. Excuse me? Are you concluding then that this shot to the right eye area of Kitty Menendez definitely rendered her unconscious and that there was no further volitional movement from her after this shot was inflicted? No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is I don't know which of the shots, and I don't think Dr. Golden knows. That's why he called two of them fatal shots, and he said between two shots and three, or between shots 2 and 3, he couldn't tell. He couldn't differentiate the paths apart. Now, if he saw this buckshot in the back of her brain and said that's fatal, and then he says, well, I can't tell if it's 2 or 3, then maybe he called them both fatal because of that. I don't know. I'm not asking you right now if it was fatal. What I'm asking you is it your opinion that once that shot was inflicted to the right eye of Kitty Menendez, that thereafter she was unconscious and there was no further volitional movement on her part? That's a possibility. I can't say it's certain, no. Okay. So because you can't say it's certain, then you can't rule out the hypothetical that I gave you that at the time that at the time that this shot was inflicted, shot number 11, she was moving either her head or her shoulder. Objection, argumentative, overruled. Let me see if I can explain this. We would have to rule it out. For your hypothetical to be true, you assume we're talking about the last two shots. You're saying those are two bird shots. Mr. Khan says, at the moment, I'm simply asking you whether Kitty Menendez would have had her head raised for the shot 11, being the next to the last shot in the sequence, such that a single shot could have struck both her left shoulder and the area of her left ear. I think it's highly unlikely after shots 2 and 3, both of which were buckshot, one of which produced a pellet back near the brainstem, and one which I can't tell, and I don't, from reading the autopsy, I don't think Dr. Golden can tell either. But the x ray shows one back there, specifically near a very vital area of the brain and which it came from. So if you ask me just this one, I can't say. Or if you ask me just the other one, I can't say. But it's from one of them because it's the number 4 buckshot. It's not birdshot. The court says, let's take our recess and we'll resume at 3:30. Don't discuss the matter with anyone. Don't form any final opinions about it. A recess was taken from 3:15 to 3:45, and we will read the rest of this day, which is November, what is it? I don't know. November 21st, Wednesday or Tuesday, November 21st, the week of Thanksgiving. We're going into a 4-day break for the court, so they're trying to get scheduling and things out of the way and worked out. So that's where I am going to leave you. We will continue tomorrow with right where we left off. So thank you guys so much for watching. Please don't forget to hit the like button on your way out, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care. Bye now.